Welcome back to our channel. Owning a farm in a neighborhood that barely tolerates lawn gnomes was always going to be a challenge, but I never expected to be dealing with HOA Karen calling 911 on my property, let alone her being the one they came for. It all started when I inherited my grandfather's 15-acre farm just outside the city limits. The farm had been in my family for generations, a peaceful place where we grew produce, kept livestock, and lived quietly. The farm was on the edge of a residential neighborhood, and while the HOA had no authority over my land, Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA president, certainly tried to. Karen had been a thorn in my side since day one. She hated that my farm didn't match the neighborhood's approved suburban aesthetic. She despised my red barn, the smell of hay, and the noise of my animals. She tried everything, demanding I remove my fences, calling my farm unsanitary, and even telling my farmhands they couldn't park on my property. But her biggest attack was on my livestock. Karen launched a petition to ban my chickens, goats, and cattle, claiming they were loud, unsanitary, and disruptive. Never mind that my property wasn't part of the HOA, or that my family had farmed here long before the neighborhood even existed. I ignored her demands, and that only made her escalate. She filed noise complaints about my roosters, called city inspectors claiming zoning violations, and tried to have my fences taken down for blocking the neighborhood's view. When all of that failed, she did what any entitled Karen does. She called the cops. I was in the barn when I heard sirens. At first, I thought it was just a passing patrol car, but when two cruisers pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly who was behind it. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans. The officers got out, and behind them, Karen stood with a smug expression. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, trying to stay patient. One officer glanced at his notepad. "We received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations." I sighed. "Let me guess, Karen?" Karen huffed. "It's Mrs. Davis to you, and yes, I reported it. This farm is a nuisance to the neighborhood." The officer said, "Ma'am, his property isn't under your HOA's jurisdiction, and according to county records, this land is legally zoned for agriculture." Karen smirked. "Oh, I think you'll want to look a little deeper." She pulled out a stack of printed documents, and the officer flipped through them, frowning. Karen had dug up every record she could find. She was accusing me of operating a commercial business without a permit because I sold vegetables, eggs, and dairy at the farmer's market. "This is a residential area," Karen argued. "Commercial operations are strictly prohibited." The officer scratched his chin. "Selling at a farmer's market doesn't make this commercial property." Karen snapped. "What about the trucks, the farm equipment, the deliveries?" "I have pictures of work trucks entering and leaving the property. Those are farm supply deliveries," I explained. "This is a working farm, the kind that feeds people." Karen was ignoring me, waiting for the officers to say something that would support her claims. Just then, a black government car pulled up. Karen frowned. "Who's that?" I smiled. "Oh, Karen, I think you're about to find out." A man in a dark suit got out. He walked past the officers and nodded. "Good morning, gentlemen. I was asked to come down here for a site visit." Karen looked confused. "Who are you?" "I work with the state's Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received a report about someone interfering with a legally protected farm." Karen's smug expression vanished. The officer handed the man Karen's complaints. "Sir, this is Mrs. Davis. She made the complaints about zoning violations and commercial misuse." The man, Mr. Leland, glanced over the documents. "Mr. Carter, you own this farm, correct?" "Yes," I said. "It's been in my family for generations." "And you're operating under a legal agricultural exemption?" "Correct," I confirmed. "The county and state both recognize my land as farmland. I have all the proper documentation." Leland turned to Karen. "Ma'am, are you aware that this farm is protected under the state's Right to Farm Act?" "The what?" Karen stammered. "The Right to Farm Act," Leland repeated. "It prevents local ordinances and neighborhood regulations from interfering with legally established agricultural operations. This includes noise complaints, aesthetic disputes, and attempts to reclassify farms as commercial businesses." Karen turned bright red. "That's ridiculous. This is a residential community." Leland turned to the officers. "Can you verify that Mr. Carter's farm was established before the neighborhood was built?" One officer nodded. "Yes, sir. The farm has been here over 100 years. The neighborhood's HOA was formed much later." Leland turned to Karen. "By state law, this farm has more legal standing here than your HOA." Karen's face twisted with anger. "This is insane. I've had to put up with the stench, the noise, and the eyesore of this farm for years. It's time it goes. Leland sighed and pulled out his tablet. Miss Davis, I'll remind you that filing false complaints against a legally protected agricultural property is harassment. Attempting to interfere with its operation could result in civil penalties. Penalties? Karen scoffed. Leland nodded. Yes. Fines, lawsuits, and possible liability for any financial damages Mr. Carter incurs from your false complaints. I had to bite my lip to stop from laughing. But Karen refused to give up. She screamed, "This is corruption. You bribed them to protect your filthy farm." Leland didn't react. "I'll be filing a formal complaint against you for repeated malicious legal actions against this farm. The Department of Agriculture will be in touch." One officer turned to Karen. "At this point, we strongly advise you to stop interfering with this property. Continuing down this path could lead to legal consequences." Karen was fuming, but didn't say anything else. The officers told her to leave, and when she refused, they threatened to file a formal trespassing complaint. Finally, she stormed off. Leland turned to me. "People like that never learn." "Never," I agreed. As the officers left, I thought the worst was over. But then, Karen's demeanor shifted completely. She turned to the officers, stammering, Wait, hold on. I called you here. You're supposed to handle him, not me." Leland remained unfazed. "Miss Davis, your complaints have been investigated and hold no merit. However, your continued interference with this farm is another matter that falls under my department's jurisdiction." Karen was visibly rattled. "This is ridiculous. You can't just barge into a neighborhood like this." Leland pulled out a booklet. "The Right to Farm Act explicitly states that anyone who knowingly interferes with a legally recognized farm can face civil penalties." Karen froze. "See civil penalties?" "Yes," Leland said. "You've filed false reports, manipulated zoning laws, and interfered with a protected agricultural operation." Karen tried to rally the neighbors, but instead of backing her, they stayed silent. One spoke up. "Karen, you've gone too far." "You've been harassing him for years," another neighbor added. "You've been creating problems where there were none." Karen's face twisted. "I was trying to protect property values." "Karen," one neighbor said, "your actions have only lowered property values." Leland wasn't done. "We'll be investigating your unlawful actions, and based on what we've heard, we may also look into how your HOA is being run." Karen's face turned white. "What do you mean?" "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct as HOA president," Leland said. "We'll be looking into it." Then a third police cruiser arrived. A younger officer stepped out and walked up to the group. "Sorry to interrupt, but we just got confirmation from the county clerk. There are irregularities in the HOA's financial filings. We need to bring Mrs. Davis in for questioning." Karen stumbled back, horrified. "What?" The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for filing false reports, fraud, and harassment." Karen screamed. "I'm the HOA president." "Not anymore," Mr. Reynolds said as she was cuffed. The neighbors clapped as Karen was escorted to the police car. One neighbor joked, "I guess she pushed too far." Leland chuckled. "Sometimes people bury themselves. You just have to stand back and let them dig." With Karen gone, the HOA under scrutiny, and my farm safe, I finally felt free. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the last we'd hear from her.